Hello and welcome back to Bookish, and welcome back to my little Tagapalooza. 3 days in a row, 3 tag videos in a row, today being the last one. This is the one I wasn't tagged to do. It is the nonfiction book tag created by Shawn D Standfast over at his channel. I'll leave a link to his channel and his video down below. I've seen this video done on a number of channels, Jason at Byways in Booklands, and Steve Donahue, and David Murphy, and some others, and I really like the questions. Because I think they kind of take you in a direction that sometimes tag videos don't always go. So I thought I would just voluntarily do this one myself. So prompt number 1 is, what subject or area of nonfiction did you begin with? Was it history, biography, science, economics, archaeology, anthropology, math, etc.? Was there a specific event, person, or book that set you on your path? So my first nonfiction love and my still primary nonfiction love is history. That is my subject. I kind of don't really separate history and biography, probably because the biographies I read are of historical personages. But to me, my first love, my first reading love, my first interest that I had at all was in the area of history. That's where I started, and that's probably the responsibility of my dad. My dad was, for a brief period of time, a history teacher, and he's always been an amateur history buff, and his main area of interest has always been the American Civil War. And I think what started me off on kind of my love for history was he had a set of books, kind of big, oversized books, published by American Heritage, and he had one about the Revolutionary War, and he had one about the Civil War. And the Civil War book was my favorite. There are all kinds of pictures in it. I have to admit, as a kid, I didn't read the text. I just looked at the pictures, and I probably looked through that book about the Civil War hundreds of times. And my favorite part about it, and if I can figure it out and find examples, I'll put a little picture over my shoulder here of what it looked like. My favorite part about it were the battle maps, because there were these really kind of, I always thought, intricately drawn maps of the battlefield that showed, the geography, but it also showed the position of the two different armies, north and south. And it wasn't just like, blocks. It was like they actually drew little tiny soldiers involved in combat, and it showed, puffs of smoke and, the dead and the movement of troops, and it had like a little numbered legend which told you, what was happening in each part of the battlefield and when. And I just really loved looking at that book. Later, my parents got me my own version of that, which was a much smaller version of that book for kids, which I also liked a lot. So that's kind of where I got started and why I was really interested in history. Prompt 2, where did you get your first books from to feed your new passion? Was it a library, borrow from friends, family, or purchase? And did you have guidance from anyone? Well, I think primarily my parents were the first source of books about history. As I said, they gave me those American Heritage books, and then when I was in, I want to say I was in the 3rd or 4th grade, they got me the Time Life History of the West series. It was like a subscription series where you got like a book about some aspect of the history of the West. There was one about pioneers. There was one about townspeople, and there were these like squishy leather covers. I thought I had one here I could show you, but apparently I don't. And they had a lot of pictures and text. My favorite one was about the gunfighters, and the one about my favorite 4. There was one about Indians. There was one about chiefs, both of which are, obviously culturally incorrect. The 3rd one was about American soldiers on the plains, and the 4th one was about gunfighters. I really liked the one about gunfighters because I had to tell you, as a kid growing up in Texas, I had probably an inordinate interest in guns, and it had this whole kind of full color spread of all kinds of guns and handguns. Anyway, so my parents probably fed that more than anybody else. I also was, for a while as a kid, I went to the local public library in my town a lot, and the librarians there helped direct me to books about history, and so yeah, that would probably be where who guided me there and gave me the books. Number 3, Is your first love still the love of your nonfiction reading life, or was it a gateway to other subjects that took over as number one? Well, if we want to include biography as being something separate from history, and again, I really don't. My love of history led to my love of reading biographies. Biographies are actually my favorite, and I think you can learn a lot about. I realize they're oftentimes the history of great men and women from the past, but since those people were in a position where their actions were recorded and they did have influence, you can learn a lot about a time period by looking at the people who were powerful during that time period. So I would say that for the most part, I have stuck to history, and biography. So nothing's taken over for number one for me. That would still be true. Prompt number 4. Did you pursue any of your interests with formal education at university level? If so, what level did you finish, and was the experience you had hoped for and expected? Have you made it your profession? The answer to all those questions is yes. My undergraduate degree is a BA in history. I actually had a double major in history and political science because I do love a good political argument, and I thought politics for a while. I have a master's degree in American history, and I teach history. I've taught history for 31 years in a public high school in the state of Texas. I've pretty much taught every history subject that we teach. I taught what we call world history for a while. I teach American history. Now I teach a dual credit American history college course that's embedded at my high school. But I've taught government. I've taught economics. Seems like I've taught one. Oh, yeah. So I've taught a number of subjects related to history, but history is the thing that I've taught the most, and that's been my profession. Prompt 5: If you maintain the first interest all of your life, do you feel you should have pursued other interests or subjects? Every once in a while, I think maybe I should have been, majored in English and been kind of an English teacher. My mom was an English teacher for 31 or 32 years. Her mother was an English teacher. This is where I get my love of fiction, which will come up later. And I always kind of like the thought of being able to teach those books. In some ways, I'm glad I didn't, because I think it would have been bad at kind of teaching all the ways of analyzing, breaking down books, because I think in some ways that kills the love of reading, or it kills the love of literature in a lot of high school students if you go too far with that. So it's probably best that I didn't. Prompt number 6: Are you now a specialist and read only within one area of nonfiction, or do you branch off? Do you read fiction? If so, what genres do you turn to when you want something light and different to read? So I like reading about art and art history, and I like reading about science and physics, particularly since those are subjects that I avoided and neglected in high school and college. I don't read a whole lot of books about those, probably, I don't know, somewhere 8 to 10 or 12 books about science and physics, more about art in general, but those would be my other nonfiction areas. I do read fiction. As a matter of fact, I primarily read fiction today, and I know nobody likes this classification as a genre, but for ease of telling you what I normally read, I would call it literary fiction, or that's what people call it. I also do like detective stories, mysteries. I like books like that. I like the occasional spy story. I used to be a big reader of fantasy when I was in high school and for a little while in college, but I've kind of stopped reading those things. But yeah, those are my primary areas of reading in terms of fiction. Prompt 7: If you're a specialist or not, do you prefer academic studies, general works, or scholarly but not overly academic? So as somebody who considers himself a historian, who still does research and writing in the area of history, I will tell you that I like any work of history that is properly documented. I don't read endnotes, footnotes, annotated bibliographies ordinarily, but I do like those resources being there, so when I read or come across something in a work of history, I can say, well, where did you get that? That's not something I've ever heard, or that's not something I thought was true, and then I can look at the sources, and then that lets me kind of get an idea, I think, about how meticulous the historian writing the book was about how they use their source information. And oftentimes, I think this is probably true with a lot of historians and historical writers. At some point, you kind of are always tempted to fall into a trap of overemphasizing something you find in a source and maybe, stretching your interpretation of that source material to cover a point that you think is important and want to make. And that's one of those things I like to pay attention to. So I don't care if you're a PhD, I don't care if you're an amateur historian, I don't care if it's published by a popular press or a university press. I don't care if its intent is scholarly or if its intent is more like a work of popular history. As long as that documentation's there, if I want to see it and if I want to kind of figure out how careful the author historian's been, then it doesn't bother me. Prompt 8. Do you collect books in your area of interest, or do you read and pass the books on, sell, or borrow almost exclusively from a library? If you do collect, do you prefer hardcover or paperback? Do they need to be first editions and in fine condition? Are you happy with ex-library copies and or underlining in them? That's a lot of questions. Do I collect books? I have a collection of books. I'm not sure I would call it that collecting. I buy books. I primarily buy books, books that I'm pretty sure I'm going to find useful or in the area that I like. And if I read them, I have a tendency then to keep them and put them on the shelf. I don't think that's exactly what this means, but I do have collections of nonfiction and fiction books in that regard. I don't care if they're hardback or paperback as long as they're readable. They certainly don't need to be first editions. I have a few first editions from specific authors for kind of more sentimental reasons than other reasons. I don't mind if they're underlined like everybody else, I think, who's answered this. I hate the highlighting. I don't mind underlining or writing in the margins. I wouldn't mind if the books were former library books as long as they were in good shape and they were readable without being distracted. I don't mind, like other people have said, I don't mind marginalia. Even if I don't think you know what you're talking about, at least it adds something to the history of the book itself by letting me know, who's owned it and what they've thought. Let's see. Prompt number 9. Do you collect exclusively newer publications, or do you enjoy reading what writers had to say on your subject in the past as well? What is the oldest book you have, either original edition or a reprint of an older work? Well, a reprint of older work, the oldest book I have, if we're counting reprints, would be the paperback copies of Herodotus and Thucydides and Tacitus, but I don't really think that's what this means. So I'm just going to go with the oldest actual book I have, and I don't, like I said, I don't go out of my way to collect first editions or have a book collection as for the point of having a collection, but the oldest book I think I have is this book called Winning a Cause, World War I Stories. This was published in 1919 in the United States of America, and it basically is a piece of propaganda which attempts to paint the Allies who won World War I in the best possible light to justify U.S. involvement in that war. And it's a book written primarily for school kids with kind of exciting stories, but it has like these really kind of funny, not funny, but it has these really biased descriptions of the soldiers of the various armies. And the German soldiers are always, animalistic and evil, and the Americans are always, honest and open and brave. And anyway, it's an interesting book, and I found it when I was doing some research about World War I fiction, and so I like that book, and I've kept it. That's probably the oldest book that I have. Let's see. And then prompt number 10 is, what was the most you've ever paid for a book in your main area of interest, and was it new or used? So the answer to that is not actually a book at all. It's this roll of microfilm. So when I was doing research for my book, I was able to search archive collections at university libraries, at least to find out what they had. Back then you couldn't actually search and open and read the documents themselves, and even a lot of these things I don't think have been digitized, but I found the Scribner's archive, Scribner's the publisher's archive, at the university, at Princeton University's library, and the author I was researching and writing about was a Scribner's author. I was able to locate the fact that hundreds of his letters between that author, Thomas Boyd, and his editor, Max Perkins, the kind of famous editor from Scribner's, Max Perkins, were there. I was able to find letters from F. Scott Fitzgerald to Perkins about Thomas Boyd, and so to get my hands on that so I could do that research and write my book, I ordered this roll of microfilm from Princeton University, and I believe it cost me $235, which is the most I've ever paid for anything like that. But again, it's not a book, it's just a microfilm of copies of the letters I requested. And so I had to use it, I had to go to a university library and use their microfilm readers, which I kind of wonder if those things still exist anymore. Maybe I can find one at a library surplus, so if I ever want to go back through these letters, I can find it again. Anyway, there you go. There's the nonfiction tag. I want to thank Shawn for creating this awesome tag. This was a fun discussion. Let me know what you think in the comments section below, and as always, thank you for watching.